Ethan stood in the dim light of his kitchen, sipping on a bitter cup of coffee, his thoughts miles away from the present. At 43, his life was steady but predictable, anchored by his role as a foreman and a father to his bright 20-year-old daughter, Lily. The tranquility shattered with the sharp ring of his phone. "Mr. Carter?" the voice on the other end asked. "This is City General Hospital. Your daughter has been admitted." Panic seized him as the voice gave clipped instructions. Within minutes, he was in his truck, speeding through empty streets. The antiseptic glare of the hospital lights met him as he stormed in, his gut tight with dread. Lily lay on the bed, her face marred by bruises, her lips split, her eyes glistening with fresh tears. Ethan's heart clenched as he approached her. "Dad." Her voice was weak, but filled with a mix of fear and relief. "I'm here, Lily." "What happened?" he demanded, his tone even but edged with fury. Through sobs, Lily explained how she had come home early from a friend's house, only to hear sounds coming from upstairs. Investigating, she had caught her mother, Jessica, in bed with her uncle, Brian. When she screamed in shock, two men, Brian's hired thugs, had attacked her, throwing her down the stairs. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. "They're still there?" he asked. Lily nodded, whispering through her tears. "They're drinking, laughing." He kissed her forehead, his mind already formulating a plan. "I'll be back," he promised, his voice a calm contrast to the storm brewing inside him. Ethan left the hospital, his expression carved in stone. The truck's engine roared as he drove home, the image of his bruised daughter seared into his mind. Parking a block away, he approached the house silently, every step deliberate. Years in the military had honed his instincts for situations like this, though he had never imagined applying those skills here, in his own home. The faint thrum of music and muffled laughter leaked through the open front door. Ethan slipped through the side entrance, moving like a shadow. Cigarette smoke hung in the air, mingling with the sharp scent of whiskey. His living room, once a place of comfort, was now defiled by Brian and his cronies. Brian lounged on the couch, Jessica draped against him, her blouse loose and her demeanor smug. Two large men stood by the window, their postures lazy but their gazes sharp. Ethan recognized the arrogance of men who believed themselves untouchable. "Get out," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. The room froze. Brian turned, a smirk spreading across his face. Well, look who decided to come home." Ethan's eyes didn't waver. 5 seconds, or I start removing you." One of the bodyguards stepped forward, his grin mocking. "Listen, buddy." Ethan moved. His fist crushed the man's larynx in a single strike, and before the other could react, Ethan's elbow drove into his nose, shattering cartilage. Both men hit the floor in seconds, one gasping for air, the other unconscious. Brian staggered to his feet, dragging Jessica with him. "You're insane," he sputtered, but his fear betrayed him. Ethan advanced, grabbing Brian by the shirt and slamming him against the wall. "My daughter," he growled. "You had your men throw her down the stairs. She's in the hospital because of you." Brian's face paled. "It wasn't me. I didn't." The crack of Ethan's fist meeting his jaw silenced him. He let Brian drop to the floor, groaning and clutching his face. Jessica tried to speak, her voice trembling. "Ethan, please." "Shut up," Ethan snapped, his glare silencing her. "Pack your things and get out. If you're still here when I come back, you'll regret it." Jessica hesitated, her eyes darting between him and Brian. Ethan's cold stare made her decision for her. She stumbled out of the room, her sobs echoing faintly. Ethan knelt beside Brian, who was curled up in pain. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Not by a long shot." Ethan sat in his truck just down the block, watching the chaos unfold at his home. Jessica hurried out with a hastily packed suitcase, glancing back nervously. One of the bruised bodyguards hobbled to a car, the other trailing behind, clutching his ribs. They loaded Brian, still groaning, into the back seat before speeding off. The house felt like a shell when Ethan returned, the silence heavy. Broken glass glittered on the carpet, the whiskey bottle they had drained lay tipped over on the coffee table, leaving a dark stain. Cigarette burns marked the furniture, their contempt etched into his home like a scar. Ethan moved methodically, cleaning the mess, but not out of any desire to restore order. Each movement was calculated, his mind already plotting his next steps. He needed to know how deep Brian's betrayal went, how far Jessica had been willing to follow. If there were others involved, he would find out. He retrieved his phone, dialing an old contact he had not spoken to in years. "It's Carter," he said when the voice on the other end answered. "I need intel. Deep background on Brian Harper. Everything from his business dealings to his hired muscle. And dig into Jessica, too. I'll make it worth your while." The voice responded with a chuckle. "Still getting into trouble?" "Huh, Carter? Give me 48 hours. Ethan hung up without another word. Time was something he had, but not patience. With every passing minute, his fury hardened into resolve. The next day, Ethan returned to the hospital. Lily's face was less swollen, though the bruises had darkened. She smiled faintly when he walked in, but her eyes betrayed her worry. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Ethan asked, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "Sore," she admitted, her voice soft. "The doctor said I can go home soon, but I don't want to go back there." "You won't," Ethan assured her. "You'll stay with Sarah and her parents for a while. It's safer that way." Lily frowned. "Mom called me this morning," she said, her tone hesitant. She tried to explain, said it was all a misunderstanding. She said it was my fault for coming home early. Ethan's jaw tightened. He paced to the window, gripping the sill as if it were the only thing keeping his rage contained. "Listen to me, Lily," he said, turning back to her. "None of this is your fault. Not a single part of it. Do you understand?" Lily nodded, but tears welled up in her eyes. I feel so stupid. I should have seen something was wrong. Mom and Uncle Brian, they were always whispering when you weren't around. I thought it was just business." Ethan knelt beside her, taking her hand gently. "You trusted her. That's what a child is supposed to do with their parent. You didn't do anything wrong." Later that night, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, the room dimly lit by the overhead bulb. His phone buzzed, and he answered it immediately. "I've got what you asked for," the voice on the other end said. "Your brother-in-law? He's dirty as hell. Runs a protection racket, launders money through his businesses, and keeps some very unsavory company. Those bodyguards? They're not just hired muscle. One of them's tied to a local crime family. As for your wife," the voice hesitated. "She's been funneling money into offshore accounts for the last 6 months. Looks like divorce papers were drawn up, too." Ethan sat back, the weight of the information pressing on him. "So, they were planning to clean me out. Seems that way. She's been working with Brian for a while. It wasn't just an affair. It was a partnership." Ethan's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the table. "Thanks," he said, his voice cold. "Send me everything you have." The call ended, and Ethan stared at the darkened screen of his phone. The betrayal ran deeper than he had thought. It was not just about Jessica's infidelity or Brian's arrogance. This was calculated, a scheme to destroy him completely, his family, his finances, everything he had worked for. The next morning, Ethan drove out to meet an old friend, David, who had spent years in law enforcement before retiring to private security. The two men sat across from each other in a dingy diner, the smell of burnt coffee and grease hanging heavy in the air. "Long time, Carter," David said, studying Ethan's face. "You look like you've been through hell." "I've seen worse," Ethan replied evenly. "I need your help. My brother-in-law's involved in some serious criminal activity. I want it all exposed." David raised an eyebrow. "You're not thinking about handling this yourself, are you?" Ethan's silence was answer enough. David sighed. "All right, I'll help you, but only because I know you're too damn stubborn to back down. Just be careful, Carter. Guys like Brian, they don't play fair." "I'm counting on that," Ethan said, his tone grim. David slid a folder across the table. "Everything I could find on Brian and his associates. Use it wisely." Ethan flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the details. Every connection, every dirty deal, every weakness was laid bare. Ethan left the diner with the folder tucked under his arm, his resolve solidifying with every step. He spent the afternoon poring over the details at home, piecing together a plan that would unravel Brian's web of deceit. Names, dates, and connections began to align, each thread leading to a deeper level of corruption. By evening, he had enough to bring the house of cards crashing down. He called David again. "I need one more favor. Can you get me in touch with someone at the DA's office?" "Carter, you're walking a dangerous line here," David warned. "You sure you want to play it this way?" "I'm sure," Ethan replied. "If this goes wrong, I need the law on my side." David sighed, but agreed to set up a meeting. The following day, Ethan met with an assistant district attorney named Laura Hayes, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her early 40s. She listened intently as Ethan laid out what he had uncovered, her pen scratching against a legal pad. "This is big," Laura said, her tone both impressed and concerned. "If your information checks out, we could take down not just your brother-in-law, but an entire criminal operation." "It checks out," Ethan assured her. "I have the evidence to back it up." Laura leaned forward. "You understand this won't be easy. People like your brother-in-law don't go down without a fight. They'll come after you." "They already have," Ethan replied, his voice steely. "They hurt my daughter. I'm not backing down." Laura studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, I'll start the process, but I'll need your cooperation every step of the way. And Carter, watch your back." Ethan returned home, a grim sense of purpose driving him forward. That night, as he sat in the dimly lit living room, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Brian. "You have no idea what you're messing with. Back off." Ethan smirked, the threat only fueling his determination. He typed a response. "You made this personal. See you soon." He hit send and leaned back in his chair, his mind already planning his next move. 2 days later, Ethan stood outside an unassuming office building in the industrial district. This was one of the hubs where Brian conducted his shadier dealings, according to the intel Ethan had gathered. He had no intention of waiting for the law to catch up. Some messages needed to be delivered personally. Ethan entered the building quietly, his footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and sweat. He found Brian in a small back room, seated at a table with 2 of his lackeys, papers and cash scattered in front of them. Brian looked up, his smug expression quickly replaced by a flash of fear. "Ethan," he said, his voice faltering, "what the hell are you doing here?" "Cleaning up a mess," Ethan replied, stepping further into the room. The 2 bodyguards rose, but Ethan moved before they could react. He drove his fist into the gut of the first man, sending him crashing into the table. The second reached for a weapon, but Ethan was faster, slamming him into the wall with a bone-crunching thud. Both men were on the ground within moments, groaning in pain. Brian scrambled to his feet, his hands raised. All right, let's talk about this." Ethan closed the distance between them in a heartbeat, grabbing Brian by the collar and slamming him against the wall. "You had my daughter thrown down a staircase," Ethan growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You think I'm here to talk?" Brian sputtered, his bravado crumbling. "I didn't mean for that to happen. They weren't supposed to hurt her." Ethan tightened his grip. "But they did, and you let it happen." "I can make it right," Brian stammered. "I can fix this." Ethan let out a bitter laugh, his grip never loosening. "You can't fix anything, Brian. You and Jessica planned to ruin me. Now it's your turn." Ethan let Brian fall to the floor, watching as he scrambled to catch his breath. He grabbed the stack of papers on the table and scanned them, his suspicions confirmed. Bank transfers, property records, evidence of Brian's schemes laid bare. "I'll be keeping these," Ethan said, tucking the documents under his arm. "You'll be hearing from the DA soon." Brian glared at him, his fear momentarily replaced by rage. "You think you're some kind of hero? You think you're better than me?" Ethan paused in the doorway, looking back over his shoulder. "I don't think. I know." Ethan left the office building, his heart pounding with adrenaline. The papers he had taken were enough to ensure Brian's criminal empire would crumble, but Ethan knew it was not over yet. People like Brian did not go down quietly. Back in his truck, Ethan called Laura Hayes. "I have more for you," he said, his voice firm. "Documents tying Brian to money laundering and fraud. I'll bring them to you tonight." Laura's response was immediate. "Good. We'll need every shred of evidence if we want to secure warrants. But be careful, Ethan. If Brian suspects you're working with us, he'll escalate." "He already knows," Ethan replied. I'm counting on it. That night, Ethan met Laura at a secure location, handing over the papers. She scanned the documents, her expression shifting from professional detachment to grim determination. This is enough to take him down, she said. But it's going to take time to put it all together. Time isn't a luxury I have, Ethan said. Brian's already sent his goons after me once. He won't stop until I'm out of his way. Laura nodded. We'll move as fast as we can. In the meantime, I'll assign someone to keep an eye on you. Do not waste resources on me, Ethan said sharply. Focus on Brian. I can handle myself. Laura hesitated, then relented. Just do not do anything reckless. Ethan gave a cold smile. No promises. The next morning, Ethan's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. You should have stayed out of this. You're dead. Ethan's lips curled into a grim smirk. Brian was getting desperate. That made him dangerous, but it also made him sloppy. Ethan spent the day preparing, securing his house, and making arrangements for Lily to stay with Sarah's family indefinitely. His focus was unrelenting. He could not afford distractions, not when the stakes were this high. That evening, David called. We've got movement, he said. Brian's guys are headed your way. Good, Ethan replied, his tone ice cold. Let them come. When the sun set, Ethan was ready. He sat in his darkened living room, his gun resting on the table in front of him. The faint sound of tires crunching gravel reached his ears, followed by the muted thuds of boots on the porch. The first man kicked the door open, stepping inside cautiously. He did not get far. Ethan struck from the shadows, disarming him in a single fluid motion before delivering a punishing blow that sent him sprawling. The second man hesitated at the threshold, his hand on his weapon. Do not make me do this, Ethan warned, his voice a growl in the darkness. The man hesitated for a moment too long. Ethan moved like a predator, subduing him with brutal efficiency. Within minutes, the house was silent again, the two intruders incapacitated on the floor. Ethan crouched over the first man, his expression deadly. Tell Brian I'm coming for him, he said, and tell him he's already lost. Ethan tied up the two intruders and dumped them on Brian's office doorstep just before dawn. A single note pinned to one of their jackets read, "This is just the beginning." By the time Ethan returned home, the sun was rising. His body ached from the night's events, but his resolve was stronger than ever. He had sent a message, and now it was time to tighten the noose. Later that morning, Laura called. We got the warrants, she said, but we're still gathering intel on his associates. It's a bigger operation than we thought. You were right. He's been laundering money through shell companies for years. Good, Ethan replied. Keep digging. I'll make sure Brian stays occupied. You're playing with fire, Ethan, Laura warned. Do not make this personal. It's already personal, Ethan said, ending the call. Brian was unraveling, and Ethan knew it. Over the next few days, he watched from a distance as Brian scrambled to contain the chaos. His men were growing nervous, and his once polished demeanor had been replaced with frustration and fear. Ethan's next move came 2 days later. Using the intel Laura had shared, he anonymously tipped off the press about one of Brian's shell companies, a front for laundering money. The story hit the headlines the following morning, complete with damning evidence. Brian's name was not directly mentioned, but anyone paying attention could connect the dots. The backlash was immediate. Brian's business partners began to distance themselves, fearing the fallout. One by one, his support network started to crumble. Ethan watched it all unfold with grim satisfaction. He was not just dismantling Brian's empire. He was erasing the illusion of power that had shielded him for so long. That evening, Ethan received another message. Meet me at the warehouse tonight. Let's end this. It was from Brian. The tone was unmistakable, desperate and threatening. Ethan knew it was a trap, but he also knew it was an opportunity he could not pass up. He arrived at the warehouse just after midnight, his senses sharp. The dimly lit space reeked of oil and mildew. Brian was waiting in the center of the room, flanked by 2 of his remaining lackeys. His face was pale, his confidence a shadow of what it once was. You've done enough, Ethan, Brian said, his voice trembling. This doesn't have to go any further. Ethan stepped forward, his expression calm but unrelenting. You hurt my daughter. You try to destroy my life. You think this ends because you say so. Brian took a shaky step back, motioning to his men. Take him. The fight that followed was brutal but swift. Ethan moved with precision, his military training giving him the edge. Within moments, Brian's lackeys were on the ground, groaning in pain. Ethan turned to Brian, who was now trembling with fear. This ends when I say it does. Brian stumbled backward, his hands raised in a feeble attempt to shield himself. Ethan, wait. We can make a deal, he pleaded, his voice cracking under the weight of his panic. Ethan closed the distance between them in 2 deliberate steps, grabbing Brian by the collar and slamming him against the nearest wall. The sound reverberated through the empty warehouse, followed by Brian's muffled gasp. Deal? Ethan growled, his voice low and deadly. You threw my daughter down a flight of stairs. You tried to bleed me dry. There is no deal. Brian clawed at Ethan's grip, his composure crumbling completely. It wasn't supposed to go this far, Jessica said. Do not say her name. Ethan barked, his grip tightening. You think you can blame her and walk away? This is all on you. Brian's legs buckled, and he slid to the floor when Ethan finally let him go. Gasping for air, he looked up at Ethan with wide, pleading eyes. What do you want? Ethan crouched down to Brian's level, his icy gaze locked on the broken man before him. I want you to know what it feels like to lose everything, he said. The way you almost took everything from me. By the time Ethan left the warehouse, Brian was a shell of the man he had been. The confrontation had stripped him of his last vestiges of power, leaving him utterly humiliated. Ethan had made his point, and now it was only a matter of time before Brian's world collapsed completely. The next morning, Laura called with an update. The press is all over the story, she said. Brian's associates are turning on him left and right. He's losing everything. Good, Ethan replied, his tone devoid of emotion. Make sure it all sticks. It will, Laura assured him. But Ethan, there's still a risk. People like Brian don't go down without taking others with them. I know, Ethan said. I'll be ready. Ethan spent the following days preparing for the inevitable backlash. He fortified his home, stayed in constant communication with Laura, and ensured Lily was well protected at Sarah's house. Every move he made was calculated, each step designed to stay one step ahead of Brian's crumbling empire. As the pressure mounted, Brian's desperation reached a breaking point. Rumors swirled that he was planning to flee the city, but Ethan knew better. Brian would not leave without one last attempt to claw back what he had lost. That attempt came one rainy night, when Ethan received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was one he had been waiting for. You think you've won? Brian spat, his words slurred with fury. This isn't over, Carter. Ethan smirked, his grip on the phone tightening. It's over when I say it's over. The call ended abruptly, but Ethan knew Brian was not bluffing. The man was cornered, but cornered animals were the most dangerous. Ethan spent the rest of the night methodically checking his security measures and reviewing every detail of Brian's operation. There was no room for mistakes. The next evening it happened. Ethan had just finished a call with Laura when the lights in his house flickered. He stood by the window, peering into the darkness. The hum of an engine reached his ears, followed by the unmistakable crunch of gravel under tires. They were here. He moved swiftly, extinguishing the lights and slipping into the shadows of his home. Years of military training took over as he positioned himself strategically. The first thug kicked open the back door, his silhouette outlined against the moonlight. Ethan waited, calm and patient. The second intruder followed, and that was when Ethan struck. He took down the first man with a silent but brutal blow to the back of the head. The second spun around, weapon drawn, but Ethan disarmed him in one fluid motion, sending the gun skidding across the floor. The man lunged at Ethan, but he was no match. Ethan subdued him with calculated precision, leaving him gasping on the ground. Tell me where Brian is, Ethan demanded, his voice steady but cold. The man hesitated, but a sharp twist of his wrist convinced him to talk. The docks, he gasped. He's hiding at the warehouse near Pier 6. Ethan released him, letting him slump against the wall. Get out, he growled, and tell Brian I'm coming. The warehouse was quiet when Ethan arrived, The only sounds the distant lapping of water and the faint hum of dock machinery. He moved carefully, his footsteps silent against the damp concrete. Inside, Brian sat alone at a desk, surrounded by scattered papers and an empty whiskey bottle. His head snapped up as Ethan entered, the color draining from his face. "You really should have left town," Ethan said, his tone almost conversational. Brian reached for a gun on the table, but Ethan was faster. In seconds, he had crossed the room, slamming the weapon out of Brian's reach and pinning him against the wall. "This ends now," Ethan growled, his eyes burning with fury. Brian whimpered, his bravado completely gone. "Please, Ethan. I'll leave, I swear. You'll never see me again." Ethan's grip tightened, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You already took too much. My daughter. My life. My trust. Now it's your turn." By the time Ethan left the warehouse, Brian was nothing but a broken man. Ethan had taken every piece of leverage Brian thought he had, ensuring that he would never threaten anyone again. The next morning, news broke of Brian's arrest. Laura had acted quickly, using the evidence Ethan had collected to bring Brian's entire operation crashing down. Headlines declared his empire dismantled, his allies abandoned him, and his reputation was irreparably destroyed. Ethan watched the coverage from his living room, his expression unreadable. It was over, or as close to over as it could be. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the sound of reporters' voices filling the room. They detailed the fall of Brian's empire, the arrests of his associates, and the exposure of his crimes. It should have felt like a victory, but Ethan only felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. The doorbell rang, pulling him from his thoughts. He opened the door to find Laura Hayes standing there, a file tucked under her arm. "Mind if I come in?" she asked. Ethan nodded and stepped aside. Laura placed the file on the kitchen table and sat down. "We've got him," she said. "Brian's going away for a long time. He's tried to cut a deal, but he doesn't have enough leverage left to negotiate anything significant." "Good," Ethan said flatly. "And the others?" "Most of his associates have flipped. The operation is completely dismantled. But you should know, your name came up. Brian claims you took justice into your own hands." Ethan's gaze hardened. "Did he give proof?" Laura shook her head. "No. And even if he did, it's his word against yours. But be careful, Ethan. People like him hold grudges." "I'm not worried," Ethan said simply. "He's powerless now." Laura sighed. "Just don't let this consume you. Brian's done, but you've got a life to rebuild. Focus on that." Ethan walked her to the door, her words lingering in the air. Rebuild. It sounded simple, but he knew it would not be. Over the next few weeks, the dust began to settle. Lily came home, her bruises fading, but her spirit still shaken. Ethan did his best to create a sense of normalcy, but the shadow of what had happened loomed large over their lives. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Lily broke the silence. "Do you think Mom knew how far this would go?" she asked, her voice tentative. Ethan exhaled slowly. "I don't know. But she made her choices, and those choices hurt us. That's all that matters." Lily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "She called me again." "What did she say?" Ethan asked, his tone carefully neutral. "She said she's sorry," Lily replied, her voice heavy with emotion. "But I don't think I believe her." "You don't have to," Ethan said firmly. "She lost the right to ask for forgiveness." Lily looked at him, her eyes filled with both sadness and determination. "We'll be okay, right?" Ethan put an arm around her shoulder, pulling her close. "We will. It'll take time, but we'll get there. Together." The months that followed were a slow but steady process of rebuilding. Ethan focused on his work, pouring his energy into projects that kept him busy and gave him purpose. Lily found comfort in her friends and eventually began to smile again. Jessica remained a distant figure, her attempts to reach out ignored by both Ethan and Lily. She had chosen her path, and they had chosen to move forward without her. As for Brian, he disappeared into the prison system, his name reduced to a footnote in stories about his crimes. Ethan knew he might resurface one day, but he also knew he would be ready if that happened. Years passed, and the events that had once consumed Ethan's life became memories, distant but never forgotten. Lily thrived, channeling her pain into strength. She graduated college with honors and started a career in social work, helping others rebuild their lives just as she had rebuilt her own. Ethan remained a steady presence in her life, his protective instincts never wavering. Though the scars of betrayal lingered, they no longer defined him. He had found peace in the simplicity of his routines and the quiet satisfaction of seeing Lily flourish. Jessica, true to form, had faded into obscurity. She remarried and moved to a different state. Her attempts to reconnect with Ethan and Lily met with silence. Her life, once built on manipulation and greed, had crumbled into mediocrity. Brian's name occasionally resurfaced in news articles, but his power and influence were long gone. He had become a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most untouchable empires could be brought down. One evening, as Ethan and Lily shared a quiet dinner on the porch, she turned to him with a smile. "You know, Dad, you're my hero," she said softly. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Ignoro, Lily. I just did what needed to be done." "Well," she replied, "sometimes that's exactly what makes someone a hero." Ethan looked at his daughter, the pride in his eyes unmistakable. He had lost so much, but he had also gained something priceless, a deeper understanding of what truly mattered. Family, loyalty, resilience. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ethan allowed himself a rare moment of contentment. The war was over, the battle won, and the future was theirs to shape.